Well, thank you, Julie, and thank you very much for the invitation to come and give this talk. It's quite exciting to be able to come and talk about an object which I find really interesting, but then again, my interests are a little strange. So I hope by the end of this talk, you will agree that it's fairly interesting as well. And you may have noticed, based on Julie's introduction and a comparison with my slides, that I've done something a little naughty and I've changed the title of my talk slightly. I've taken out the 12th century part of the title because in doing some research for this talk, I have become increasingly convinced that this is not a 12th century manuscript, that it's probably a 13th century one, but I will say a little bit more about that later. So forgive the little emendation there, and I will explain what that's all about later on. So I will talk about this manuscript in due course, and I think it's interesting for all sorts of reasons. And it's fun for me to be able to work on it because some of you may know, and most of you won't, that I was both a classics and medieval studies undergraduate, and so this is sort of allowing me to dive back into an interest that I've put on hold for a long time, really. I won't start by talking about this manuscript, though. I do want to start instead by setting the scene a little bit and just giving you a little bit of background information about Western Europe at the end of the 12th century, or if we're thinking of this in very broad terms, at the very beginning of the 13th century. Because I don't assume that we have too many experts in this room, even though I know from a quick look around, sort of terrifyingly, that we do have a few. So, Europe at the end of the 12th century, or the beginning of the 13th, was a very busy place and a very interesting place at an interesting moment in its time. All places tend to be busy at all times in different ways, but a lot was going on in Europe at this time. We had a lot of political turmoil, or we have a lot of political turmoil, so the emperors of the Holy Roman Empire, which is largely modern Germany and parts of Italy today, were intermittently at war with the popes. We've got all sorts of cultural change happening. We have crusaders going across the Mediterranean to defend usually not particularly successfully, Jerusalem at this time. By the end of the 12th century, Islam very much has the upper hand in the East. We've got a lot going on with the economy, but I'm not even going to try to tell you about the economy because I don't do economic history. What we particularly have going on, though, in Western Europe at the end of the 12th century and in the early 13th is a lot of cultural and intellectual activity. This is a period of extreme cultural diversification, flourishing, to some extent revival in the West, and a period where Western writers are becoming increasingly interested in digging up and reusing and getting to grips with the authors of the classical Roman past. Now, the interesting thing about the term Renaissance is that if you ask a Renaissance historian when it took place, you'll get a very clear answer. If you ask a medievalist, you may get several answers depending on whether you're talking to someone who works in the 9th century, the 10th century, or the 12th. Medievalists might say that the Renaissance had already happened several times by the time that the real Renaissance happened. For our purposes, we're thinking broadly about the context of a phenomenon which is still often referred to as the 12th century Renaissance, a period of developments in law, language, the diversification of vernacular languages, rediscovery of Latin classics, the sort of explosion of monastic cultures, the diversification of types of texts that are produced, a proliferation of manuscripts. That's the cultural context for what I'm going to be talking about today. And the final point I want to make before diving into talking about Florilegia is the fact that although this is an extremely religious period, an extremely intense religious period in the West, where Catholicism is of course dominant, the church is flexing its muscle against its enemies in both the Middle East and in parts of the West, alleged heretics and dissenters and people like that. This is not necessarily a period where people are exclusively interested in reading Christian texts. They are also very interested in reading things from the pre-Christian period, in discovering fragments from the pagan past, and in repurposing those texts for their own particular interests and functions within this period. So that's what I want you to keep in mind as we go on to talk about Florilegia. These Christian authors at this time of great cultural revival and activity are very much interested in pagan texts as well. So, without any further ado, and I've been cheeky on this slide by including a Florilegium picture, which is not at all a medieval Florilegium, it's a very modern one that I think will be fairly familiar to a lot of Australians. What is a Florilegium? So literally the Latin term Florilegium, or in a more classical pronunciation, Florilegium, is something that we call a gathering of flowers. That's literally what it means, a bunch of flowers gathered together. And it's the counterpart of the Greek word anthologion, which I did not know until I was doing research for this paper, is actually the exact literal equivalent of it. So florilegium and anthologion both mean a gathering of flowers, and anthologion is, of course, the etymological root of our word anthology. So a florilegium is essentially a compendium. They are very popular texts in the Middle Ages, and they are essentially collections of excerpts and quotations that particular scribes or particular writers think might be useful or interesting or valuable, whether just for their inherent meaning, for their aesthetic beauty, or for particular practical purposes like writing letters or zhuzhing up speeches or giving zing to particular sermons and things like that. They tend to be compiled more and more from the 4th or the 5th century on, particularly the 5th century, and they become extremely popular in what we sort of sometimes still call the High Middle Ages, so the 12th and 13th centuries and even beyond. There's a real explosion of these texts in sort of conjunction with the 12th century Renaissance. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, of these things surviving. I really want to stress that these are a very common type of text. These are not unusual manuscripts. They're sort of circulating quite widely. People are interested in them. They're being compiled at all sorts of different cultural centres. And I think that really speaks to the interest in classical learning at the time. Because one of the key points about these florilegia is that even though they can include excerpts from Christian authors, they tend to feature excerpts and quotations and snippets from classical authors very, very heavily. So they're little notebooks, essentially, of all sorts of bits and pieces that authors find interesting from a whole different spectrum of contexts. There's been a suggestion, particularly by some of the scholars who I've listed on the bibliography on the handout, Rouse and Rouse in particular, that as the 13th century goes on, florilegia that are compiled as notebooks or as compendia tend to be used more and more as preachers' aids. So the idea is that in the 13th century, preachers who are putting together their sermons might start looking to florilegia more and more to kind of incorporate interesting or pointed or particularly insightful content into their sermons to get their message across more effectively. So that's something that I think could well be the case for the manuscript I'm going to talk about today, but I won't say anything more about that just yet. So to give you a sense of the sorts of reasons that someone might read a florilegium or consult a florilegium in the Middle Ages, I've pinched this little excerpt from a prologue to a florilegium in Trois Bibliothèques Municipales Manuscript 215, which is a text which we know as the Florilegium Douaicense, or the Florilegium of Douai. And in the prologue to this little compendium, the scribe writes, "From this book may the uncultivated mind take something with which to educate itself, the clever person something to occupy them, the languid something to fire them up, the weak something with which to comfort themselves. May the sick take something from this with which they may be cured, the healthy something with which they may be protected, the tired something with which they may be refreshed, the hungry something with which they may be fed. And may the studious person read this, and the scornful person too, the former so that they may be stimulated, and the latter so that they may be delighted. May the simple person read that which is understood in itself, and may the pauper have that which he may be able to write, that with which he may be able to write." So in the view of this particular scribe writing in this particular Florilegium manuscript, not our Florilegium, which doesn't have a prologue, the Florilegium can be anything to anyone, essentially. It's supposed to be a literary smorgasbord, offering up whatever you want to take from it. It can offer up encouraging thoughts, stimulating ideas, consoling texts for moments where you need a bit of a pick-me-up in your life. It's a text that has multiple purposes, multiple functions, and based on this sort of idea, multiple meanings. So, having spoken about what florilegia are and sort of given you that cultural context, I want to talk now about one particular florilegium, which is a text that we call the Florilegium Angelicum. And it's not called the Florilegium Angelicum because it has anything to do with angels. It's not a particularly angelic text or group of texts. The reason it's called the Florilegium Angelicum is because its principal manuscript, or one of the earliest manuscripts that's very significant, is held in the Bibliotheca Angelica in Rome. And that's manuscript A on the list of manuscripts I've listed on the handout. So the Florilegium Angelicum, like all florilegia, is basically just a compendium of excerpts from ancient and late antique letters, and orations. And I want to stress that point, that most of the texts excerpted in this Florilegium are letters and speeches, essentially. There's a few other bits and pieces, a bit of poetry, a bit of prose outside these contexts, but speeches and letters are the main focus of this text. Most of the authors included in it are classical. There are a couple of Christian ones, and the main authors featured in this compendium are Macrobius, who was a early 5th century, late 4th century grammarian and Neoplatonist philosopher, and senator. There's St Jerome, the translator of the Vulgate Bible. There's Apuleius, who's most famously known for his Golden Ass or Metamorphoses. Pliny the Younger, Cicero, Seneca, Aulus Gellius, the author of a collection of short memoir-like texts called the Attic Nights, and Ennodius, who was writing in the Ostrogothic Italy. Most likely, the Florilegium Angelicum was compiled in the 3rd quarter of the 12th century, and it was probably put together at Orleans. There are various reasons for thinking that, which I won't really go into in this talk. Rouse and Rouse have written a great article on it, which is listed in the bibliography, and I think they make a reasonably convincing case that this text is put together at Orleans in the late 12th century, which is Orleans at the time is quite a centre of classical dissemination and a fairly key sort of piece in the overall picture of classical learning and intellectual activity in France in that century. So it's a fairly reasonable place to think that this might be put together there. There are about 20 or more manuscripts surviving of this text, so that's a fairly striking amount. I think a lot of you will be familiar with the idea that texts don't often survive in many manuscripts from the Middle Ages. Some of the most famous works from the Middle Ages survive in one manuscript, like Beowulf, the Old English poem, for example. But there are others that survive in hundreds. 20 is a pretty decent number. This suggests that it was a reasonably well-known and fairly popular text. And it's worth pointing out that the early manuscript I mentioned that gives this manuscript its name is actually dedicated to a pope. It has a prologue dedicating the text to a pope. We don't know exactly which pope that is. There's been all sorts of discussions about it. The strongest arguments have been made for Pope Alexander III, who was the pope between 1159 and 1181, and a fairly strong opponent of the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. So it may well be Pope Alexander III whom this text is put together for. And I'd mention in that context that one reason we think it may be for Alexander III is that he employed several people from Orleans in his papal chancery. So he certainly got intellectual contacts with Orleans. So just to very quickly show you an attempt at mapping some of the manuscripts of the Florilegium Anglicanum, and a little hint to any budding medievalist in the room, don't try this at home. If you try making one of these, you will go mad within minutes and want to throw a brick through your computer screen, particularly if, like me, you're not particularly good with computers. But this is a really sort of quite simple attempt at mapping these things. This is what we call a stemma codicum, or a sort of diagram, like a tribal descent diagram of manuscripts. And you can see that it goes from the 11th century up the top down to the early 16th century at the bottom. Most of the manuscripts in this tradition cluster around the late 12th century or the early 13th century. Our manuscript is this manuscript here, manuscript N, University Library Nicholson 2. And Rouse and Rouse have actually argued that this text does descend pretty much independently from all the others from the archetype text, which we've now lost. It probably didn't descend directly from it. I'm sure there were lost manuscripts between the two because it's only an extract, abbreviated kind of version. But I think the argument that it comes from the archetype along a different pathway is fairly convincing. So, but the point of all that is to essentially suggest to you that we need to update our catalogues on this text because none of them identify it as anything in particular, but it's quite clear from the work that Rouse and others have done that this is a copy of the Florilegium Anglicanum. Angelicum. I've been doing too much work with Anglo-Saxons lately. But it is a copy of the Florilegium Anglicanum. It's an abbreviated copy which has only extracts from it. And I think that's a significant point worth stressing because it is a fairly widely distributed text, at least in France at the time. So that's something worth thinking about. As you'll see if you come and have a look at the manuscript at the end of this talk, it's quite small. It's 158 by 130 millimeters per folio, and there are 32 folios throughout the text. So that's an extremely light, compact, very portable manuscript. It's the sort of thing that would have been quite easy to carry around. And I will end this talk by suggesting the name of someone who may have carried it around at one point in time. The handwriting of the text suggests that it's from France, and as I mentioned at the start, I don't think it is actually from the late 12th century. Sinclair's catalogue of manuscripts in Australian libraries dates it to the late 12th century fairly confidently. The work done by Rouse and others, they sort of variously date it from either the early 13th century to the mid 13th century. I think, with just from a glance at the hand, I haven't had a lot of time to work with this manuscript, that it is probably a 13th century text. But either way, one of the reasons I wanted to talk about it today is that it's certainly one of the older pieces of writing that we have in our medieval collections here in the Fisher Library. We have one leaf from the 11th century, I think, a single leaf from a benedictional or a psalter, like a prayer book. We have a 12th century copy of some of the works of St Augustine and one or two other things, and then that's sort of it. And then we've got bits and pieces from the 13th century, and we have more and more as we go on. So whether it's late 12th century or early 13th, this is a very old piece of work, possibly around 800 years old, which is quite exciting. I've mentioned that it derived independently from the archetype, and I find that view quite convincing. And the cataloguers who've worked with this text tend to suggest that it was written by one scribe throughout. That's definitely the way it seems, but I am not entirely convinced about that. I think one of the things I want to stress in the last half of this talk is that there's a lot more work to do on this manuscript. I think it's quite an exciting text that students or colleagues or anyone might want to consider working on. And one thing that needs a lot of work is the handwriting. I really don't think there's a strong case without further detailed work that there's only one scribe at work here. There's certainly lots of different scribes scribbling in the margins, as I'll show you in a moment. The manuscript has a bit of a mysterious history, like most medieval manuscripts do. From its copying and its compilation in the early 13th century, we don't know anything about it after that point until it comes into Sir Charles Nicholson's possession and is donated to the University Library with his estate in 1924. So between the 13th century and the early 20th, we know nothing about what was happening with this manuscript. So that's again another, I think, very interesting problem that needs to be investigated with this manuscript. And there may be no answer. There often isn't with medieval texts like this, but it's still worth thinking about. So, what's in this thing? There's a fair bit in it, and I'm not going to try and break down absolutely everything because we'd be here all day. But just to give you a very quick sense of what's in it, we have a lot of classical work. So the text begins with a very interesting text by Macrobius, who I mentioned earlier, called the Saturnalia, which is a kind of like a dialogue encyclopedic compendium of ancient proverbs and sayings and knowledge and things like that. And it draws on a lot of classical texts in its own right. It wasn't as well known in the Middle Ages as some of Macrobius's other works, but it certainly was known in some areas. So all copies of the Florilegium Angelicum start with the Saturnalia. We have other little compendium texts in here, like this little one called the Proverbs of the Philosophers. We have some excerpts from St Jerome's letters. We have bits and pieces from Apuleius' treatise on the god of Socrates, which is talking about the daimonion, or conscience or inner voice, that Socrates allegedly discussed and had. We have Pliny the Younger's letters, which is quite an unusual text in the Middle Ages, not very widely known. Cicero speeches, bits and pieces from Seneca, the Roman philosopher. A very popular text in the Middle Ages, Boethius on the consolation of philosophy. Some more Seneca, and then here's the bit that excites me, unidentified extracts. Rouse, who wrote a little bit about this manuscript, had consulted it in microfilm, and I think they obviously couldn't see it very clearly, and they sort of have a note to that effect. So there's stuff in here that still needs to be identified, and I think it probably may not be anything too exciting, but the fact we don't know what it is an opportunity. We see the same thing at the very end of the manuscript down here, and before that we get all sorts of other bits and pieces. So more Cicero, the great Roman orator, Aulus Gellius with its Attic Nights, Ennodius, not necessarily a hugely well-known text in the Middle Ages either. This one here, the Querulous, is an unusual one. It's a late antique Latin comedy, drama play, a dramatic play. We don't have many Latin comedies at all surviving other than the works of the Roman comedians Terence and Plautus. So this is a fairly striking text, and again, not very well circulated in the Middle Ages. So the value of manuscripts like this is that they transmit things that we don't necessarily have surviving in many copies. They show us where and when they were transmitted, and they also show us what people were interested in reading. So having sort of given you a quick overview of the contents, you might look at that and ask, well, why do we really care if it's essentially stuff that we have surviving in other manuscripts? What's the point of knowing about, what's the point of Florilegia if they just give us snippets of things that we have preserved in full elsewhere. And I think the most eloquent answer I can give to a question like that is this nice little quote from a recent, very short piece by Julie Barrault at Cambridge, who writes that because each text and each assemblage of texts in a medieval manuscript was a one-off effort, each was in effect unique. This means that no book is ever exactly the same as another one, even if their contents seem to be so. We're all deeply steeped in print culture, where the potentially endless identical reproduction of textual material is the norm, and the creation of new texts is a totally distinct process, that of authorship. The limit between textual creativity and textual copy was infinitely more blurred and possibly partly irrelevant in the medieval West. So I think the point that Julie Barrault makes here is very important. The idea that just because this text preserves things that we know about elsewhere, that doesn't deprive it of value in its own right. It shows us, gives us information about reading patterns, what people found interesting, what was influencing people's ideas. This particular manuscript can, I think, help fill out our picture of the broader tradition of the Florilegium Angelicum, which is a picture that we haven't finished filling in yet. So small manuscripts like this, even though they seem derivative, can offer all sorts of different information and I think a lot of value to our understanding of medieval thought, and that's an important thing. So, having spoken about the contents, I want to focus in the remainder of this talk on some of the features of the manuscript itself. How was it used? How is it structured and put together? And can we say anything about the content that sheds any particular light on how it was put together and who may have read it? One of the first things I should point out is that it's not a particularly beautiful manuscript. It's fairly plain overall, but it does have a lot of decorated initials. Most of the texts that I listed back on these two slides in the contents are introduced by fairly elaborate decorated initials. So to the left here, we have the opening decorated initial, which is quite pretty. And then these are just some examples of text beginnings from the rest of the manuscript. Interestingly though, very, very few of the texts have a title introducing what they are. So the scribe who wrote the main text didn't fill this in. There are some gaps, which I haven't actually got any images of here. But if you look at the very first folio, up the top we have this little thing here in a different hand in a space that says Apuleius excerpta, so excerpts from Apuleius. That's wrong. That's actually wrong. The scribe is incorrect there. It's not from Apuleius, it's from Macrobius. And there's another bit in the text where there's a little note saying explicit excerpta de libro Apulei. Here end the excerpts from the book of Apuleius. That's also wrong because that seems to be at a point where the excerpts from Apuleius actually start. So that's all we really get in the way of titles in this manuscript, and otherwise we get a lot of blank spaces where somebody was obviously meant to come in and write the titles of the works but didn't do it. So unfortunately the reader who was trying to use this thing would have had to kind of just guess who was saying what at any given point. They weren't big on their referencing systems like we are today. They didn't worry too much about that kind of stuff. In terms of the content, look, I think there's a lot to go through with this manuscript, but I just wanted to pull out one very quick example. It's interesting in a Christian context like this, when you're drawing out pagan learning and compiling it for Christian readers, you need to sort of make it palatable to them, and you need to make sure that it fits in to some extent with Christian thought. So there's this nice little quote here from the very first folio, sed loquendum est cum hominibus quasi Deus audiat. One should speak with men, or we must speak with men, as if God might be listening. Seems fair enough, very unobjectionable in a Christian context. This is not what it actually said in the original manuscript, or the original text by Macrobius. The original text said, philosophers say that we should speak with men as if the gods might be listening, and speak with the gods as if men might hear. Now, obviously a Christian scribe is not going to be interested in this second part, speaking with the gods as if men might hear. Who cares, thinks a Christian scribe. And in the first bit, gods is not going to hold in a Christian context. That's not going to be acceptable in a late 12th century, early 13th century scriptorium. It's not that they're not aware that pagans worshipped gods. They were, and they discussed that quite a lot. But for the purposes of turning this into a little quotable quote for moralizing purposes or educational purposes, this needs to talk about God, not God's plural. So the scribe or the compiler was obviously very interested in making sure this fit the context. The manuscript was certainly used. We know that it was used after it was originally compiled because throughout the margins we have all these little notes, which if you've worked with manuscripts before, you'll have seen these quite often. But these are little notes that we call maniculae, little hands. And they are interesting because on the one hand, they make you think that they've never seen a hand before. And on the other hand, they sometimes make you wonder if they really had hands in mind at all when they were drawing them. But they are little hands, and they're designed to point towards passages of the text that the reader at that time found particularly interesting. This is a practice that becomes more and more prominent from the 13th century on. So I think that's something at least in favour of the argument that the text was used in the 13th century, even if it may have been composed in the 12th. And you can see that on some pages in particular, here, folio 31R, they just go nuts. I mean, there's 5 or 6 of them on there at least. And I think that's another thing that may repay a little bit of closer study with this manuscript. There are several different annotational hands, I think, that might need to be looked at here. So we have maniculi in the margins, and we have some other notes in the margins as well, which call to mind that idea I mentioned that Rouse puts forward, that these things are used more as preaching aids as the 13th and 14th centuries go on. Particularly in the early leaves of the manuscript, we have these little notes in the margin, some of which I've actually found very hard to read, and I think that's another thing that needs further study, saying things like contra mulieres, against women. That's not very nice, but not entirely surprising for a medieval scribe. Contra judices, against judges. Here, de contemptu mundi, concerning contempt for the world or rejection of the world. Here we've got contra histriones, against actors. Contra pigros, against the lazy. And then contra detractores, against detractors, or in modern parlance, haters. So I think whoever was doing these little annotations had everything covered. He obviously had a passage in mind to use against anybody who he wanted to preach against. And I think it is some potential indication that someone was using this while putting together sermons or letters or something like that, designed to have an argumentative point to them. And this is an easy way of going back to the passage that you need when you really want that quotable quote that's going to just make the very decisive, incisive impact that you want it to make. There's a final little note, or a second last note, and this is getting close to the end here. There's a little note on the second last folio, the bottom of the second last folio, which I'm offering extremely loose, or at least tentative translation of here, because I'm not entirely sure I'm satisfied that I know what it means. There are better Latinists in this room than I, so I'm looking forward to talking to them and getting a sense of what they think it might mean. But the translation I've offered of these quite rude little verses here is something like, in intercourse I suffer 6 hurts, for I pay a price, and I offend God because I abound in filthy dirt. And I pour good fluid from my own body, I cut off life, and I lose zeal with my reputation. So I suppose the 6 hurts are paying a price, offending God, being covered in filth, pouring fluid from the body, I think we all know what that means, cutting off life, and then losing one's reputation and enthusiasm. So these lines are actually penciled in by 2 different scribes, or inked in by 2 separate scribes, whose little verses seem to make sense together. So medieval scribes got bored. They had active imaginations. They liked to play around just like anyone. So they did sometimes write rude things in the margins, and that's clearly what's going on here. You can see, though, from not just the colour of the ink, but even the style of the handwriting, that it's clearly separate scribes than the main scribe of the text. So someone may have been bored one day while doodling that. And then finally, this is one of the most intriguing things about the manuscript. We have a little note at the very, very bottom of the final folio, which you can come and have a look at in person at the end of the talk, which allegedly reads, because this is according to people who've catalogued this manuscript, and I think they may be right, Iste liber est ad usum fratris Laurentii. This book is for the use of Brother Lawrence. That is supposedly this smudged writing here. It's essentially been erased. Someone has come through and erased that, probably because the manuscript was no longer in Brother Lawrence's possession and they didn't want it to be seen as his text anymore, so they fairly understandably wiped it out. But that is an intriguing little hint as to the actual lived usage of this text at some point in the medieval past. It seems as if at some point there was a man called Brother Lawrence who owned and used this thing. So, just to finish up, I want to suggest that this text actually offers more questions than answers. And the reason I want to suggest that is because I think it needs further work. So first of all, there's the very obvious question, which we can't answer right now, about where this manuscript was copied. Probably in northern France, maybe in Orléans, if that's where the original Florilegium Angelicum comes from, but I wouldn't want to pin anything down on that just yet. Where, when, by whom, and for what purposes was it used? We just don't really know much of this at the moment. I think we can infer some of those things from the margins, but without further study, I'm not going to make any strong claims. I think there's an interesting question about how it relates to the other manuscripts in the tradition. We've got 20 plus manuscripts of this Florilegium in some form, so it's worth thinking about how this text relates to them and what it can tell us about the original text perhaps and how it fits into the tradition. Who was Brother Lawrence? It would be very hard to find him. You'd have to go through all sorts of monastic cartularies and list of names and all sorts of things, and it would be very boring, and you'd probably come up with hundreds of Brother Lawrences and we would never know who it was. It's still worth looking into. His name was probably erased because somebody else took possession of the manuscript, but there may have been another reason. And then one other question, though I think there are several more, is when, where and how did Charles Nicholson acquire it? Because I certainly don't know. If anybody does, I'd be interested to hear it. And that's what I would like to end with, and a strong encouragement to please work on this thing. Students, I know there are a few students in the room, I hope you would consider doing something with this text. Colleagues who might have a spare moment, imagine, you might want to do something with this. I think it's an interesting manuscript that can shed a lot of light on not just the tradition of this particular text, but intellectual activity in 12th and 13th century France. And I will leave you with those questions and a little quote from the very beginning of the manuscript that, appropriately enough, things made distinct, as they are in this Florilegium, are preserved better in the mind. So thank you very much, and I will look forward to your questions.
James, thank you. How stable is the content of this Florilegium across the various copies? Is there anything distinctive in the Sydney one?
There is. It does tend to vary a bit. The Rouse and Rouse chapter talks in quite some detail about this. One thing that's interesting is that at this point here, where Quintus Curtius comes in, some very short excerpts from his Histories of Alexander the Great, a lot of the manuscripts in the tradition actually end at that point. This manuscript and a couple of the others include the Quintus Curtius material and some of the texts after that. But most of them tend to end with Censorinus de Die Natali on the birthday. So there's that to keep in mind. And some of the other texts throughout are only preserved in a couple of the manuscripts, but not necessarily the original two. So yeah, it's not entirely stable, but there is a sort of fairly established core to the tradition that most of the texts have, to some extent.
Thanks, James. It was very good. Just one question about the other manuscripts again and its relationship to them. Are they all the same small size?
They generally are pretty small. I was sitting yesterday looking at the measurements of them, and most of them are quite small. There is one which is, I think, something like 20 millimeters or 25 by 20 or something like that. But
the page size or the written space?
Yeah, good question. They don't make it clear in here. Yeah.
It's just if the normal thing is landed about 30 pages, that's what, 2 gatherings, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. So the general impression I get is that they are quite small and following this idea of being fairly portable. Even the dedication copy, which is manuscript A, up here, the Bibliotheca Angelica copy, which was copied from P but then corrected against the archetype apparently. Even that one's quite small. It's not a big elaborate sort of presentation.
So maybe even the archetype was
probably, yeah. I think it's quite
yeah.
probable. Yeah. So yeah.
James, if I may, I have one question. I was wondering, it might have an obvious answer, but how do you go about identifying unidentified texts?
Yeah. It's good that you asked that, because I did want to talk about it, but not necessarily in the talk itself. It staggers me, and of course I would say this as someone born in 1988 and largely conversant with the internet age. It staggers me how pre-internet scholars were able to find quotations so easily when they're unmarked. I mean, you use things like concordances and dictionaries and just excellent knowledge of Latin, which I think we're tending to lose. So back then it was quite hard. These days, with search engines, not just Google, which, as I keep saying to students, is not your friend, not just Google, but all sorts of search engines and databases and library catalogues, it is much easier to find quotations. So even while I was putting this talk together, one great resource I found and hadn't used for a very long time, I don't think I'd ever used it when I was an undergraduate because it didn't exist, was the Loeb Classical Library Online. And you can search that. So I would sort of take snippets of quotes and put them in there, and it leads you straight to the text that has it. Or within Macrobius' Saturnalia, I would search for phrases from this manuscript, and it would pretty much without fail take me to the section that I needed to see. So I think it's a lot easier now with search engines, but there is still a little bit of luck to it. And I think ensuring that you choose the phrases carefully rather than just plugging in a whole 3 or 4 lines of text, which I think won't get you very far. It's important to go phrase by phrase or clause by clause. But it's tricky and it's persistent work, but I think it's easier than it used to be. And luckily there's not too much in this that hasn't been identified yet.
Thanks. Have you had the opportunity to look at any of those other copies?
No, not yet, no. I mean, I have to admit, even this manuscript is not something I've worked a lot with. The reason I sort of became aware of it was that over the last few years I occasionally hold little manuscript classes in the Rare Books Library at the end of semester with Old English and Old Norse and even Latin students. And it struck my notice in the catalogue and I thought that sounds interesting, particularly because I thought it was 12th century, and being someone who works largely on the 12th century, I thought that's exciting. And I think I'm probably wrong, but it is an interesting text. So I haven't done a lot with it, and because I haven't done a lot with it, I actually haven't sought out many of the other manuscripts. Fortunately though, I noticed the other day, the Vatican Manuscript here, P, which is one of the earliest ones, that is completely digitized on the Vatican Library website. I would have included photos from it, but I think that may have breached copyright rules with this recording going on, so I decided not to do that. But that one is completely digitized, and I think most things from the Bibliothèque Nationale in France are quite easy to get digital copies of too now. So there are other manuscripts I didn't list here in the tradition that should also be reasonably easy to find. So I think they're out there and they're very accessible generally. The Rome one, unfortunately, not so much.
Okay, please join me in thanking James again for his talk.
Thank you all.